The original Nightmare on Elm Street is not only my favourite horror film of all time, it's my favourite film of all time. And so there's nothing I'd rather do than talk about A Nightmare on Elm Street. Unfortunately, that's not what I'm going to be doing today. Instead, I'm going to be mounting a defence of what I consider to be the least successful film in the original franchise, at least as a piece of entertainment, and that's Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. Even though I don't especially enjoy the film, I nevertheless consider it to be an important, ambitious and significant movie. As a headline, I'm defending this film on the basis that it's a kind of anti-reboot. Now, I'm not entirely happy with that phrasing, it's just the best way I could think to articulate what I'm trying to get towards. It's slightly hyperbolic as a phrase, and I'll do some unpacking of that phrase as I move forward, so please bear with me. Before I get to that unpacking, however, I need to lay out a little bit of context. You might be very familiar with this context, but please bear with me because it's vital for setting up the argument that I'm seeking to make. The first piece of context is industrial, and it orients around a broad and crude heuristic. The first is that in the 1980s we saw the rise of an industrial trend towards sequelization. Sequelization has become synonymous with the horror genre and especially the slasher film, but it's a broader industrial trend across the 1980s in Hollywood filmmaking generally speaking. The second industrial trend that I'm paralleling this to is the era of reboots, which typically speaking we'd associate with the early 2000s. Now the term reboot itself is quite woolly, so to give you a sense of what I mean, really what I'm talking about are films that are effectively sequels under a different name. So by the early 2000s, studios and distributors were cognizant that many of the major long-running sequel series, especially the horror sequel series, were 20 plus years old, and so it was becoming increasingly difficult to attract audiences to come and see the 12th or 13th part of a series, or even expecting audiences to be cognizant of the continuity that had built up across that many films. Younger generations might even have not seen the original films or might not be familiar with them, and so might be even less inclined to attend a later film in that kind of series. And so it became increasingly common to market new sequels to long-running series under a title such as Friday the 13th, for instance. And so studios could effectively deliver a new sequel while also appealing to audiences who hadn't seen the previous sequels and allowing writers to jettison some of the continuity that might have become problematic or thorny as this series developed in their original runs. Freddy's Dead sits between these two periods. But in order to understand what Freddy's Dead is doing, we need to first consider how the slasher subgenre sits between these two industrial trends. Notably, these two trends or these two approaches become entangled in a really interesting way really quite early on in the subgenre's development. So let's stick for a moment with the Friday the 13th series. In 1984, Friday the 13th launched what was at the time proposed to be its final chapter. By this point, in 1984, the critical consensus was that the slasher film was played out, that there'd been mass market saturation from the late 1970s to the early period of the 1980s where numerous properties had been released, and in this case numerous sequels had been released to the same property, and that box office returns were waning. And this prompted the release of the final chapter of the Friday the 13th series. Of course, that didn't last very long. The next year, we see the first semi-reboot of the series with A New Beginning. Now, this attempt at rebooting the series was perceived as a failure because audiences felt cheated that Jason hadn't returned, but nevertheless, it's a clear attempt to reboot the series. In parallel to this, in 1984, we get a different reboot, which is a reboot of the slasher subgenre more broadly. A Nightmare on Elm Street reinvigorated the subgenre by solving many of the problems that had led to burnout in the early 1980s period. One of the problems with the boom period slashers of the early 1980s is that they involved human killers stalking and killing other humans, usually stabbing people with a knife. As one critic put it at the time, there's only so many ways to stab a nubile teen. Effectively, the subgenre burns out because it's repeating the same kind of action over and over again. A Nightmare on Elm Street solves that problem by leaning towards the supernatural, therefore allowing a different kind of more creative killing. And this is one way it reboots the subgenre, skewing it off towards the supernatural and towards more fantastic kills that really made more of the increasingly spectacular skills of effects artists in the period. The second way A Nightmare on Elm Street reinvigorates the subgenre is again via its supernatural bent. One of the problems facing the Friday the 13th series at this point in time is that Jason Voorhees was supposed to be a human killer, and the problem with each film is that the lead protagonists have to kill off Jason, but Jason has to nevertheless come back from the dead for the next sequel. A Nightmare on Elm Street cleverly solves that problem by having a lead protagonist who is always already dead. It's much more forgivable that he's brought back for every sequel because he was always dead in the first place. A Nightmare on Elm Street effectively reboots the subgenre because it has a profound impact on the films that followed it. And again, we can see that impact on the Friday the 13th series itself, which had yet another reboot in 1986 with Jason Lives. And in this film, Jason comes back from the grave as an undead ghoul and therefore can carry on throughout the rest of the series as this kind of supernatural figure. Moving forward, we see another rebooting within the slasher subgenre, but way before the reboot period of the early 2000s, in the form of Wes Craven's New Nightmare in 1994, which itself reboots the A Nightmare on Elm Street series. What I'd like to note from all this history is that the slasher subgenre seems to be quite ahead of the industrial curve, simply because of some of the complicated ways in which sequeling and rebooting come to merge together in the slasher subgenre really quite early on. In my view, there are two reasons why the slasher subgenre was ahead of this curve, and those have to do with how the subgenre was developing from its earliest stages forward. The first consideration is that there was such mass market saturation in the very early 1980s that the codes and conventions of the subgenre got pinned down very quickly and very robustly. And that facilitated a degree of mimicry within the subgenre and of repetition within the subgenre in those very early stages. And I think that's itself, that kind of repetition is what led to these major sequel series that we see developing across the 1980s, including the Halloween series and the Nightmare on Elm Street series and the Friday the 13th series. Now, the way that critics were responding to this saturation and the advent of the sequelized series in the early 1980s was to complain of diminishing returns. That is, the repetition that comes along with saturation and with sequelization is taken to be a signal of a lack of creativity or the dearth of imagination. Again, none of that is new. I think it's just amplified by the particular industrial circumstance and the degree of that saturation that we see in such a short period of time. Now, the way I read this situation is that this context encourages creativity, even if within the limits of the subgenre as it's set up and the kinds of expectations audiences have, and within the need to create a film that is recognisably aligned with other films in the subgenre. Market saturation effectively encourages creativity because it generates a need to stand out in the marketplace. Sequelization encourages the same kind of creativity. Underlying the sequel is the impetus to repeat the same story and the same characterization effectively, but to do so in new ways that keep the property fresh, to keep attracting audiences back. And it's into that complicated terrain that Freddy's Dead enters. Notably, Freddy's Dead was released towards the tail end of the sequelization period, yet before the reboot period, at least as broader industrial trends. Now, I need to outline what Freddy's Dead is doing in three ways before I make three claims about Freddy's Dead. The first thing to note is that Freddy's Dead is very aware of why this series, and perhaps why slasher sequels generally, had to end at this point in time. The second notable thing that Freddy's Dead does is it actively ends the sequel chain. This is really important because of the history that I've just laid out. As was demonstrated by Friday the 13th, the final chapter, just titling the film Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare might not mean very much as a promise to consumers. Freddy's Dead cleverly flags that as a possibility, flags the possibility that it might still just come back the next year in basically the same form. And that's laid out up front during this sequence.
But nothing will ever kill me. Well, let's see now. First, they tried burning me. Then, they tried burying me. But this is my favorite. They even tried holy water. But I just keep on ticking.
This is part of Freddy's Dead demonstrating that it's aware of what it's doing, yet everything else that happens in the film points towards the opposite conclusion, that Freddy really will be dead at the end of this film. The third thing that's notable about what Freddy's Dead is doing is that it anticipates the reboot era. I can refine these three elements via my three claims, which I'll go on to evidence for the rest of the talk. The first claim I want to make about Freddy's Dead and why it's an interesting and significant film is that it actively seeks to detonate the series where it stands. And this is to ensure that the series can't just simply come back in the same form as it was. My second claim is that the film exaggerates the attributes that have become characteristic of the series as a whole, especially the negative attributes that have become synonymous with the series. My third claim, and this is where I would like to caveat my original proposal that Freddy's Dead acts as a kind of anti-reboot, is that Freddy's Dead anticipates the reboot era by itself adopting elements of the reboot. Freddy's Dead achieves this by making radical revisions to some of the characters, the characterization, and the lore. My claim is that it doesn't do this to effectively reboot the series, but to make sure that the series can't just be brought back with yet another sequel that's doing the same kind of things that the series has been doing across the 1980s. Before I begin, there's one other caveat I need to lay out, and that is to do with my claim that the series is aware of what it is and what it is doing. There's a difference between self-awareness and self-consciousness that it's worth being cognizant of. Self-consciousness is really associated with coming to the fore in the subgenre with 1996's Scream, which is a highly self-conscious film. That's when self-consciousness really becomes a norm within the subgenre. The slasher subgenre exhibits self-awareness much earlier, and the epitomizing film of that trend is, for me, Jason Lives, which is highly aware of what the Friday the 13th series is at that point in time. And notably, Freddy's Dead sits directly in between these two poles of 1986's Jason Lives and its self-awareness and 1996's Scream and its self-consciousness. Directly in the middle, we get Freddy's Dead in 1991. Now, the difference between self-awareness and self-consciousness I don't have too much time to go into, but as a broad model, being self-aware means being aware of what you are. Being self-conscious, on the other hand, entails being aware of how other people perceive you, or at least making assumptions about other people's perceptions and internalizing those, especially perceived negative judgments. That's the difference, at least from my perspective, between what Jason Lives does and what Scream does. Freddy's Dead ultimately leans more towards self-consciousness than just self-awareness. And you can see how it's built into the DNA of what Freddy's Dead is doing in the way that the creatives responsible for generating Freddy's Dead talk about the intellectual property and the series around the time of the creation of Freddy's Dead. Rachel Talladay I consider to be the creative driver for Freddy's Dead as the director, and she is someone who at this point in history has an intimate familiarity with the series and how it's developed because her career has largely developed in tandem with the development of the Nightmare on Elm Street series. She was involved from the earliest films, and she'd worked her way up through New Line Cinema to the point where she was entrusted with directing this major film, the final film in a series that had come to define what New Line Cinema was. So if Talladay is saying it's probably time to wrap up the series and her career is so intertwined with the series at this point, it suggests that there is good reason for the series to end at this point in time, and that she's very conscious of the series needing to end at this point. The self-consciousness also plays out via the very performative way the film was marketed even before anyone had seen it, when, for instance, they staged a funeral for Freddy Krueger as a publicity stunt to try and attract people to this event film. Now, we can read this as assenting to the negative judgments made by critics of the series at the time. To give you a sense of what that negative judgment looked like at the time, here are 3 indicative responses to Freddy's Dead, which capture the critical tenor of the period, which had been mounting with every sequel across the 1980s, really from the second Elm Street film forwards, and it was just becoming increasingly amplified in the criticism. So, on the release of Freddy's Dead, Mennell noted that there'd been a steady decline in quality across the series, and it was now time to bury this ugly phenomenon. Schoen referred to Freddy as a crepuscular old ham who'd taken one too many curtain calls, and Hutchison greeted the promise that Freddy was now dead simply by bluntly stating, "Good riddance." These indicative reviews are a crescendo to the critical tenor that had been building, especially since parts 4 and 5 were released. Now, you can almost imagine an alternative universe where the creatives at New Line Cinema and Talalay and Robert Shea and so forth thought to themselves, this is going to be the final film in the series. Let's give the fans what they want. Who cares what the critics think at this point? They hate us anyway. Let's double down on what we've been doing all along. Instead, they take a much more interesting approach, which is to internalize the negative judgment and to reproduce it. Instead of ignoring the critical problems, they instead lean into them. They amplify those sources of critical complaint. And it's in this sense that Freddy's Dead is clearly trying to be something much more ambitious than just another sequel in a chain. And that's even evident in the approach taken to titling the film. The film is called Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare. It is not called A Nightmare on Elm Street 6, Freddy's Dead, or A Nightmare on Elm Street 6, The Final Nightmare, which would fit with the established pattern of naming these films. By titling the film Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare instead of Nightmare 6, the film is positioned as being outside of the chain of continuity. It's adjacent to the series. And it's from that perspective that Freddy's Dead can deliberate on the series and what the series has become. And from this perspective, the film can take a much more irreverent perspective on both the series and the critical reception of the series. One of the ways that self-irreverence manifests is by reflecting back on some of the characteristics that have become part of the series as it developed. One of those core characteristics is the series' already quite irreverent attitudes towards continuity. The sequels were made in quite a tight production period. So the third film was released in 1987, the fourth in 1988, the fifth in 1989. And as the creatives such as Robert Shea have admitted, the production was sometimes quite rushed. The fourth film was particularly beleaguered by a writer's strike, and this didn't help to create a strong sense of continuity across the series. There are some film series that achieve quite a tight sense of continuity, even within this kind of very tight production turnover. One of those is the Saw series, in which a film was released every year for 7 years, and the Saw series has a remarkably tight sense of continuity across those first 7 films. One benefit that the Saw series has that the Nightmare on Elm Street series didn't is the return of key personnel, directors and writers and so forth, and producers that helped to foster a tight sense of continuity. In contrast, the Nightmare on Elm Street series brought on a new director and new key writers for every new film in the series. Now, I don't know much about how these writers and directors were hired, whether they knew they would only be on board for one film at a time, but the way they approach the material seems to suggest that they weren't too concerned with having to pick up the pieces for the next sequel. So new elements of the lore are thrown in, suddenly Freddy's mother is a nun and so forth, and it's up to the next team of writers to have to make sense of that in order to develop the series forward. And so as the series develops, it seems to foster an irreverence towards continuity, and that's most clearly manifested in the fourth film. One of the most obvious ways that irreverence manifests is in the way that Freddy is brought back by a stream of flaming dog urine. But the fourth film also takes quite an irreverent attitude to elements that have been just set up in the previous film as being really significant. The most famous of those is this.
You are the last of the Elm Street children.
So the Elm Street children are set up as this major narrative entity, and of course, famously, 30 minutes into the fourth film, all of the Elm Street children are killed off.
Now no one sleeps.
So in this instance, the last of the Elm Street children is unceremoniously dumped into a furnace, and that's the end of that line of continuity. It's hardly the defining point of the continuity that it's established as in the third film. Freddy's Dead takes that already quite irreverent attitude towards continuity and some of the difficulties it poses and really leans into those problems. Because it's slightly outside of the series, it doesn't need to follow the continuity. Instead, it starts to, in a kind of rebooty way, revise some of the major characteristics, the characters and the lore of the series. As Tosha Taylor notes, Taddale's retcon reimagines Freddy as the perverse but quintessential family man. In Freddy's Dead, we see a lot more of Freddy as a human being than we've ever been exposed to previously in the series, and that allows us to learn a lot more about him as a character. As Taylor notes, one of the major things we learn about him is that he had a wife and child before he was burned to death.
We need to talk.
More interesting to me is what happens directly after this sequence when Freddy's daughter moves down into the basement below their house and sees a number of really important things. The editing's quite rapid in this sequence, so it's passed by very quickly, but one of the things we see in this sequence is a teddy bear and a glass of milk and some cookies, which might suggest that this is an area where Freddy is bringing children to kill them, which is very different than the boiler room we've seen in previous films. But the most significant addition in this sequence for me is the various versions of the glove that we see. And that's so significant because Freddy is synonymous with the glove. Throughout the series, the glove has served a metonymic function. It stands in for the presence of Freddy. Sometimes we literally see the glove moving around. In part 4, we see the glove without Freddy killing one of the teenagers. Sometimes we hear the glove scraping along metal as a stand-in for Freddy's presence. And in fact, the first time that we hear Freddy being spoken about in the series at any length, it's in terms of that particular weapon.
Oh, he scraped his fingernails along things. Actually, they were more like finger knives or something he'd made himself. But they made a horrible sound. It's like, scream.
The realisation that Freddy has all these other different versions of the weapon is a quite radical revision to how we understand Freddy and how the teenagers across the series have understood Freddy. We've been following a particular continuity line where the teenagers associate Freddy with these particular finger knives, but based on the number of different weapons he has in his basement, there may be a multiverse of Freddys stalking teenagers who associate him with a different version of the gloved weapon. We already know from the first film, from Tina's early nightmare sequence, that he can occupy different nightmares simultaneously. The presence of different gloves might suggest that there are different continuity lines running in different directions, where Freddy's stalking different sets of teens simultaneously. Freddy is, after all, a dream demon. He can be anywhere at any time, so long as someone is asleep. That speculation might become more viable in a moment, so bear with me. Freddy's Dead is seeking to expand the scope of what the series is and does. As we learn more about Freddy as a person, we also see a quite radical revision in Freddy's motivations, or how we understand what he is doing and why. Throughout the series, Freddy says remarkably little about why he's killing teenagers. When we do hear about his motivations, it's usually via the human characters who make assumptions about what he is doing and why. Those assumptions usually go something like this.
Your parents, my parents, they burned him alive. And now we're paying for their sins.
Now, I think some of the mistake that's built into this way of thinking comes actually from the titling of the second film as Freddy's Revenge, even though he doesn't take revenge on anyone in the film. The idea that Freddy is taking revenge is repeated across the series, but it doesn't explain why Freddy was killing in the first instance. When Freddy was alive, he killed young people. He then got burnt to death by the parents of Elm Street, and then after he'd been burnt to death, he continued killing young people. The burning might give him an excuse to target particular young people after he's been burnt to death, but it doesn't explain what motivates him to kill young people in the first instance. Whatever motivated him to kill young people before he was burnt to death is likely to still be motivating him after he dies. It wasn't the burning that caused him to kill young people. And in fact, we know that it never had anything to do with the parents of Elm Street burning him to death, because he kills off the last of the Elm Street children in part 4, and he continues to kill young people regardless. He also isn't particularly bothered about the Elm Street children in part 2, where he just kills local teenagers and targets people who are in the vicinity of the particular house, 1428 Elm Street. He seems to take any excuse to target young people as a population. In Freddy's Dead, we finally hear him say why he's killing in the first instance. And the reveal is a curveball.
They took you away from me, but I made them pay. I took all their children away from them. And now, that's over.
So we finally understand why he was killing kids in the first place, and it has nothing to do with him being burnt to death by the parents of Elm Street. It's because his daughter was taken away from him, and he blames the township for that affront to his personal rights, or at least that's how he perceives it. So Freddy's Dead finally corrects this revenge narrative that's built into the series that has been offered by the human characters who make assumptions about what Freddy is doing and why. If we read this carefully, this might cause us to go back to previous entries in the series and reinterpret both the human interpretations of what Freddy is doing and also what Freddy might be doing and why he might be acting in the way he is. This is part of expanding the scope of what the series is doing. And coupled with this expanded understanding of Freddy's motivations is an expanded sense of what he's able to do within the film. Freddy's Dead doesn't just offer us an opportunity to hear Freddy talk about his own motivations, but it also fills in one of the other gaps that's been left by the previous sequels, which is how Freddy came to attain supernatural powers in the first instance. The way that plays out in Freddy's Dead is when there's a flashback to Freddy being burnt to death by the parents of Elm Street, and he is visited by 3 floating demonic entities.
We know what you want.
I want it all!
Of course you do.
Then open up.
And you shall be
Forever!
Now note the scope in the language that's being used. I want it all and being forever. And that doesn't seem quite compatible with the idea that Freddy is targeting particular parents of a particular township in Springwood, Ohio. The way these dream demons are talking is much more compatible with the idea that there might be a multiverse of Freddys attacking different sets of teenagers in different locations. Now, coupled with this expanded scope that's offered by these dream demons is a new set of abilities that Freddy hasn't exhibited in previous films. One of those abilities is that when he kills teenagers in Freddy's Dead, most of the other people occupying Springwood can no longer remember that those teenagers existed.
We got back and no one remembers John or Carlos. It's like they never existed.
This new ability is thematically important because what they're talking about here is erasing history, and that's exactly what Freddy's Dead is doing with the history of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise as it's been building as a narrative continuity. Effectively, what Freddy's Dead's story is doing is overwriting the history of the series so that it can't be brought back in the same form again. This retelling of the core story offers a range of new possibilities that aren't just limited to Freddy's supernatural powers, and that's most clearly flagged in this sequence.
Time to start all over again.
But this isn't Springwood!
Every town has an Elm Street.
And And this is where Freddy's Dead begins to feel much more like a reboot. It's expanding out beyond the confines of the series. And again, this is irreverent because as the final film in a series, Freddy's Dead should be closing down narrative threads, not expanding them outwards in this radical way. Now, notably, this is what sequels do, generally speaking, is ramp up and amplify. Sequels are driven by a logic of one-upmanship. They are about intensifying to retell a familiar story in an enhanced and therefore potentially new way, but Freddy's Dead seems to be doing much more than this. Instead, we get a transformation of the very foundations that the series is built upon. This is a zero levelling, and it's only by removing the presumed structures and confines that we've got used to that you can zero level so that you can rebuild anew. And this is what I mean by Freddy's Dead detonating the series so that it can't be brought back in the same form again. The norms and the expectations that have been built up across the previous films are forced to crumble here. But the film doesn't just do this in narrative terms, it also does it in thematic and aesthetic terms. And again, this is tied into Freddy's Dead's self-consciousness. Part of the internalization of negative judgment involves becoming aware of and leaning into some of the tonal problems that have been building up across the previous sequels. Those problems are in fact why the series had to end at this particular point in time. Famously, Freddy began the series as a sinister, shadowy figure who was barely present on screen, and when he was severely backlit.
This is God.
As the series progressed, he became a much more prominent figure. He spent a lot more time on screen. He was much more visible. He was much better lit. And his makeup got toned down from the glistening, scarred makeup we see in the first film to something rather more cartoonish, as it's illustrated by this sequence from Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5. So when you see these sequences back to back, the aesthetic shift becomes really apparent. That aesthetic lightening is coupled with the fact that Freddy became a much more prominent pop cultural figure in the period between the first film and the fifth film. So famously, Freddy became a much lighter figure in the sense that he became funnier. That reputation was enhanced by his stint as the host of his own anthology series, Freddy's Nightmares, where his major function was to tell jokes in between unrelated horror stories. And also by his stints as the host of MTV, where he largely served the same joke-telling function.
Why do I wear the razor-sharp glove? It should be obvious by now. I have a clause in my contract.
Instead of avoiding those implications, or of seeking to return Freddy to a more sinister, villainous figure, Freddy's Dead instead revels in the tonal problem. And again, this was a very self-conscious move. This is Robert Englund talking about the desire to revel in that very problem rather than avoiding it.
We intentionally made a decision, to kind of do a Warner Brothers cartoon.
Now, for anyone who hasn't seen Freddy's Dead recently, you might think that Englund is being hyperbolic here. But he means this quite literally. So, for instance, in Carlos's death sequence, Freddy goes full Bugs Bunny, gooning around behind Carlos. This couldn't be more diametrically opposed to how he's represented in the boiler room sequences in the first film. During Spencer's death sequence, cartoon Foley effects are used, such as sped up bongos. And in this sequence, Freddy goes full-on Wile E. Coyote, gurning to camera. This all really matters because of what it means in relation to the series and the character as it's been established from the first film forwards. At the end of the first film, Nancy importantly says this to Freddy.
I know you too well now, Freddy. I want my mother and friend again.
What?
I take back every bit of energy I gave you. You're nothing. You're shit.
The character is premised on his ability to incite fear as the source of his energy. If Freddy becomes knowable, he can no longer inspire fear, and he becomes nothing. By amplifying Freddy's cartoonishness, which is already problematic because of this premise, Freddy's Dead actively seeks to kill off Freddy, to disempower him. And this is the way Freddy's Dead weaponizes its understanding of why the series had to end at this particular time. Simultaneously, this approach to tone cleverly amplifies one of the other problems that has surrounded the series since its outset. As Freddy became a more prominent cultural figure across the 1980s, he became more appealing to young children precisely because he was the kind of figure that young children should not have been engaging with. The way Freddy's Dead addresses this is by, again, leaning into and amplifying a latent childishness that underpins the series thus far. Some of this is evoked by the cartoonishness that I've just referred to, but more than that, Freddy's Dead transforms Freddy into a childish caricature of his former self. And again, this is part of Talalay's creative vision for what Freddy's Dead should be, what she had to say about this.
I personally have worked to turn Freddy into a sort of combination of the Freddy we had before with a few elements of Bart Simpson added into it. He's just really become an evil, evil child.
And this spectre of childishness is evoked throughout the film in all of the death sequences. It's evoked in Carlos's death sequence via the chalkboard that's associated with the schoolroom and is seen in a schoolroom in an earlier scene.
No, please! No!
It's evoked in Spencer's death sequence, where video games are used to signal childishness, and bearing in mind that in 1991, video gaming was still seen as a children's activity.
Great graphics.
It's also notable that the characters are infantilized in different ways. That's most clear when Maggie, Freddy's daughter, is infantilized during this scene. Leaning into childishness brings to the fore something that has been bubbling under the surface of the series until this point, which itself was amplified by Freddy's transformation across the series to this pop cultural icon that children were interested in. Freddy begins the series being described as a filthy child murderer, and the sexual connotations surrounding the term filthy speaks to an implication that Freddy was a child sex abuser. The discomfort of that implication was amplified by what Freddy became as an appealing figure to children across the 1980s. And this is something that really concerned parents groups and the press as Freddy became a more prominent cultural figure. This is one of the reasons why the implication wasn't directly spelt out in the films themselves. As part of its bent towards amplifying and leaning into the problematic, Freddy's Dead finally seeks to address those complications and tensions, and that's most notably addressed during Tracy's nightmare sequence, where again she is infantilized in a way that makes it clear that she has been sexually abused as a child. This bringing to the surface is part of a broader agenda that Freddy's Dead has by being Freddy's Dead the final nightmare, which is to have the last word on all of these problematic matters that have encumbered the series to date. It meets them head on, directly admits why the series had to end, and makes sure the series has to end by bringing these elements to the fore. For all the reasons I've outlined, I really believe that when Rachel Talalay says something like this,
"Is there any chance he's going to be coming back?"
No.
that she was being sincere, that the film really was designed to be the final nightmare. Nevertheless, because of its irreverent tone, Freddy's Dead cannot help but goad people into trying to create a new film after this one. And that goading is most clearly represented in the final credits, where there seems to be this direct address to those who might try to follow from this film.
You think Freddy's dead? Do you really think that Freddy's
When Wes Craven speaks about New Nightmare and the design of New Nightmare, he often refers to having seen previous films in the series and not being able to make sense of the continuity, and that's why he had to go off in a different direction. What I haven't ever seen him address is the fact that Freddy's Dead seems to be designed to push the next filmmaker into having to take that route. Freddy's Dead's intentional detonation of the series, his anti-reboot methodology, I would argue is directly responsible for Craven having to take such a left turn with New Nightmare. In effect, Freddy's Dead is the precursor that helped to generate the postmodern slasher film that followed. It's for all these reasons that even though I don't consider Freddy's Dead to be a great piece of entertainment, I do consider it to be a significant film, not only in the Nightmare on Elm Street series, but also in the slasher subgenre. Freddy's Dead is brave, it's bold, it's ambitious, and I firmly believe that it achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve.